The fluorescent lights hum above Sacred Heart Hospital like a swarm of angry wasps trapped in plastic casings. Danielle Ross doesn't look up. She never does. Her hands move across the pediatric unit's polished floor with the methodical precision of someone who has cleared rooms under far worse conditions than hospital tile and spilled apple juice. Wipe. Rotate. Wipe. The squeegee blade catches the light. Her left forearm, scarred like old asphalt, flexes with each motion, the muscle memory so ingrained that her body moves while her mind calibrates the next sweep. Nobody watches her. That is the point. A nurse rushes past without acknowledgement. A resident scrolls through a chart, eyes locked on the screen. A mother sits in the waiting area bouncing a toddler, and she looks through Danielle the way people look through windows, something there, but not worth seeing. Danielle wears the invisibility-like body armor. The grey uniform, the name tag that reads custodial services, the way she keeps her gaze down and her shoulders slightly rounded, all of it is a language that tells the world, I am not a threat. I am not worth your time. I am nobody. In her jacket pocket, hanging on the third hook of the break room, a faded Navy SEAL unit patch is sewn into the lining. It is the only thing she owns that tells the truth. The doors of the pediatric emergency bay burst open at 10:44 a.m. Danielle is kneeling beside the water fountain, cleaning the base where juice boxes and spilled drinks leave their sticky residue. The sound, not the doors themselves, but the specific urgency of wheels hitting tile at speed, makes her head rise just enough to see. A gurney. Small. A child. Seizing. The girl's body is rigid, arms locked in an abnormal position, eyes rolled back so only the whites show. Her father grips the guardrail with both hands, knuckles white, jaw clenched so hard it looks like it might crack. Lieutenant Garrett. The uniform gives him away. Navy service dress, creases sharp enough to cut. His eyes are the worst part, that particular flavor of desperation that comes from being trained to solve problems with precision and having absolutely no solution available. He's a Navy SEAL officer watching his daughter's brain betray her, and his entire conditioning means nothing. How long? A nurse shouts, running alongside the gurney. 7 minutes, the paramedic says. Started at home. This is the 6th seizure in 14 days. Danielle's hand still. The mop rests against her leg. The numbers register with the part of her brain that never actually left Baghdad. 6th. 14 days. Not random. Not normal pediatric epilepsy with good response to first-line agents. Something systemic. Something escalating. Dr. Sterling arrives 2 minutes later, expensive Italian leather shoes clicking against the tile in a rhythm that sounds like arrogance. He is tall, silver-haired, the kind of handsome that comes from never having worried about money or failure. His white coat is pristine. His watch costs more than Danielle makes in 6 months. He sweeps into the pediatric unit the way colonizers entered new territories, confident, unquestioning, already convinced he owns the space. Bay 3, he orders, not looking at the nurse. Seizure protocol. Standard AED, 0.5 milligrams per kilo 4 push. Get me a pediatric neuroconsult and a tox panel. He says it the way other men might order coffee. Efficient. Dismissive. He does not examine Emma Garrett. He does not speak to Lieutenant Garrett. He glances at the vital signs monitor for approximately 3 seconds, blood pressure 118/72, heart rate 142, oxygen saturation 94%, and then turns back to his chart, ready to move to the next problem, the next billable consultation. Danielle watches from her corner near the sink. Her hands resume their cleaning, but her eyes track the child being wheeled into the bay. The seizing has stopped, the medication worked at least that far. But the girl's breathing is still shallow. Her skin has the waxy pallor of something systemic. Her pupils, from what Danielle can see, don't look quite right. Too wide. Unequal. That detail should make Dr. Sterling stop. Unequal pupils in a seizing child should trigger a cascade of different questions. It doesn't. Over the next 90 minutes, Danielle watches the pediatric unit transform into a rotating clinic of consultants. A neurologist arrives at 11:33 a.m. Then a second neurologist at 11:52 a.m. A pediatrician who specializes in metabolic disorders. An infectious disease specialist. A neuroradiologist. Each one enters Emma's bay for approximately 10 minutes. Each one reviews the same chart. Each one nods at Dr. Sterling. Each one prescribes variations on the same theme, more seizure medications. Different combinations. Higher doses. All rubber-stamped with the same diagnosis that Dr. Sterling established on arrival: pediatric onset epilepsy, uncontrolled, requiring aggressive pharmaceutical intervention. Danielle finishes cleaning the break room and begins her scheduled rotation through the patient records section. It is not technically her job. Custodial Services has no authorization to handle medical documentation. But the break room extends into a small office where discharge papers accumulate, and someone needs to organize the overflow, and no one has ever specifically told her no. She moves quietly. She makes herself smaller. She becomes the kind of invisible that lets people forget she is there at all. Emma Garrett's chart is 8 pages deep. Danielle reads while pretending to file. The initial presentation from 2 weeks ago is logged: febrile seizure, attributed to a childhood virus, resolved on ibuprofen and time. The second seizure, 3 days later. Third seizure. Fourth. Fifth. The pattern escalates. The medications change. The dosages climb. And the consultants multiply. By the 6th presentation, Emma is on a cocktail of 3 different anti-seizure medications. Levetiracetam at 0.15 grams per kilo. Phenobarbital at 2 milligrams per kilo. Valproate at 15 milligrams per kilo. The dosing is aggressive. The combinations are experimental. And none of the 12 doctors who have seen Emma Garrett, 12 different physicians, each one clicking in and out of the chart like passengers boarding a tour bus, has ordered basic metabolic workup. No lumbar puncture. No blood cultures. No basic infectious disease panel despite a 2-week history of fever preceding the first seizure. The chart note from neurology consultant number 3, dated 6 days ago, mentioned something in passing: patient's father recently returned from overseas deployment. Baghdad area. Possible tick exposure during field operations. That line is never mentioned again. Danielle closes the chart. Her breathing is steady. Her hands are steady. The tremor that wanted to come, that muscle response trained into her nervous system by years of watching preventable things happen, is suppressed and buried and locked behind teeth that clench once, hard, then release. She is a ghost in a gray uniform. She is nobody. She is cleaning a file room. Nothing about her posture or expression suggests that she has just read the entire clinical history of a child dying from the wrong diagnosis while 12 credentialed physicians process paperwork and send bills to insurance companies that will pay the maximum allowable amount for specialist consultation time, regardless of whether those specialists actually examined the patient. At 3:15 p.m., Lieutenant Garrett stands in the hallway outside Emma's bay, staring at nothing. His daughter is sedated on propofol. She is stable. She is also no closer to recovery. He has watched 6 seizures in 14 days. He has listened to 12 different doctors. He has heard the word idiopathic repeated in increasingly complicated sentences. Idiopathic. Unknown origin. Sorry, we do not know what is wrong with your daughter, but we are experts at treating the symptom of unknown things. Danielle pushes her cleaning cart toward the pediatric restrooms, moving within 3 meters of where he stands. She does not make eye contact. She does not speak. But her pace slows enough that she passes close enough to see his face clearly. The desperation is worse now. It has calcified into something harder, resignation mixed with fury at his own powerlessness. He is trained to lead men into hostile territory. He is trained to make decisions under fire. He is trained to solve problems with his own hands and his own mind. And he is completely, utterly helpless to help his daughter. That was when the lights flickered. Just once. A single pulse of darkness, like something was about to change, but the universe hesitated. Danielle did not know yet that by tomorrow morning, everything would be different. She did not know that the quiet question she was preparing to ask would cost her everything. She did not know that a small detail in a chart, something about a tick, something about Baghdad, something that 12 doctors had already forgotten, would become the hinge on which this entire story turned. But her body knew. The part of her that was not a ghost, not a custodian, not invisible, the part that was Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross and had spent 18 years learning to recognize when a situation was about to detonate, that part was already moving toward the answer. And moving toward the answer, in her experience, always meant moving toward a fight. She did not know it yet. But everything was about to change. Danielle Ross moved through the hallway with the same fluid precision she once used to clear rooms in Baghdad, her custodian's cart rolling silently behind her. The pediatric unit hummed with the muted chaos of a Tuesday morning, monitors beeping in measured intervals, rubber soles squeaking against polished tile, the faint smell of antiseptic mixing with coffee from the staff station. She'd been pushing that cart through Sacred Heart's corridors for 14 months now, invisible the way she'd trained to be invisible. People looked right through her, which was exactly how she needed it. The chart for Emma Garrett lay on the station counter, its thickness bloated with consultations. Danielle's eyes moved across the pages while she pretended to mop nearby, her hands working the handle in slow, methodical strokes. 6 seizures in 14 days. 12 different specialists rotating through, each one adding their name, their billing code, their signature to the same protocol. Same anti-seizure medication. Same escalating doses. No one had deviated. No one had questioned. The Keppra dosing looked wrong to her, too aggressive for a child with Emma's presentation, her vital sign patterns, the subtle details in her neuro exam that didn't quite match textbook epilepsy. Danielle had spent 3 years as a trauma medic before the SEAL teams, another 7 running medical response in hostile zones. She'd started 4s in darkness. She'd done needle decompression for tension pneumothorax in the back of a Black Hawk at altitude. She'd read human physiology the way most people read weather, understanding pressure and flow and the small warnings a body gives before it fails. But she was the custodian now. She waited until Dr. Sterling emerged from Emma's room, his white coat moving through the hallway like a sail catching wind. His phone was already in his hand, his eyes on his screen. Danielle leaned the mop against her cart and moved into his path with the careful casualness of someone who wasn't trying to be noticed. "Dr. Sterling, could I speak with you for a moment?" He glanced up, his face registering her the way you'd register background noise. His jawline carried the kind of casual arrogance that came from never being questioned, from a lifetime of people assuming his name on a diploma meant something beyond the paper it was printed on. "The Garrett child," Danielle continued, keeping her voice level. "I noticed the Keppra dosing might be contraindicated given her presenting symptoms. The muscle tone pattern, the pupillary response." "I'm sorry." He stopped mid-stride, turning slowly as if he'd misheard something preposterous. "Did the janitor just offer me a medical opinion?" The hallway didn't actually go quiet. Monitors kept beeping. Someone wheeled a bed. But Danielle felt the attention compress into a single point, every nurse at the station suddenly hyper-aware that something was happening. She could see it in the way their fingers froze over keyboards, the way one of them, a new RN named Christine, actually looked up from her chart. "I just thought you might want to consider whether." "Table wiper." His voice had the texture of ice on a frozen lake, hard and slick and the kind of thing that would break if you put weight on it. "You're not paid to think. You're paid to clean. Your opinion has exactly as much medical value as your mop does." He turned back to his phone, conversation finished. "And if I find you anywhere near patient equipment again, I'll have you written up for scope violation. Do you understand?" Danielle understood perfectly. She'd heard versions of this tone before, from men who needed the world to believe they were bigger than they actually were. The difference was, those men had usually held weapons. This one only had words and hospital credentials. She nodded once and walked back to her cart. That was when she noticed Lieutenant Garrett in the doorway to Emma's room, his dress uniform pressed sharp as a blade, his jaw locked so tight the muscle jumped like a nerve firing. His daughter was seizing in a hospital bed, and he'd just watched a custodian get publicly dismantled for suggesting her father might be wrong about something. The helplessness in his eyes looked like a wound. The disciplinary notice appeared on the public board outside Human Resources before Danielle's shift ended. Her name. The notation overstepping scope of practice and undermining physician authority. She read it once and didn't read it again. People needed to think this mattered to her. In the break room that afternoon, she sat with a cup of coffee that had gone cold sometime in the past hour. She was alone at a table that could seat 6. 3 nurses had been in the room when she arrived, Christine and 2 others whose names she never quite learned. The moment she pulled out her chair, they suddenly remembered they had things to do. Errands. Charting they'd forgotten. One of them, the one who looked like she'd been hired last, actually met Danielle's eyes for a fraction of a second before following the others out. Danielle heard the whisper as they left. Sterling's watching who talks to her. She drank the cold coffee anyway. It tasted like discipline. That same afternoon, Dr. Sterling found her in Emma's room. Lieutenant Garrett was there, sitting in a chair that was too small for a grown man, holding his daughter's tiny hand. Emma was sleeping between Seizures, her small body arranged on the hospital bed like something fragile that had already broken. "Did you touch this?" Dr. Sterling gestured toward the 4-pump, his voice sharp enough to cut. Danielle could feel the accusation in it before the words finished forming. "I was checking the level. Equipment above your pay grade, table wiper." He moved closer, his presence carrying the particular density of a man who'd never once considered the possibility that he might be wrong. "You don't touch patient equipment. You don't offer medical opinions. You don't suggest to families that their child's treatment might need reconsideration. You understand your job?" Lieutenant Garrett stood up, his uniform suddenly looking like something sharper than cloth. But before he could speak, before his hands could even clench into fists, Danielle looked directly at him and shook her head once. A small motion. Almost invisible. The kind of communication that happened in quick bursts, the way soldiers talked to each other when words would break protocol. He sat back down. Danielle felt something cold move across her face then, not fear, something that looked like fear's opposite. A single tear traced down her cheek, the kind of thing that happened when your body decided to surrender even though your mind had already won. She wiped it with the back of her hand, took one measured breath, and met Dr. Sterling's eyes with the kind of composure that only comes from having already seen the worst. "Sir, I'm simply asking you to reconsider before this child dies." The words came out quiet. Steady. The way you spoke to someone standing on the edge of a cliff who didn't realize they were about to fall. Dr. Sterling smiled then, a thin thing that moved across his face like a predator showing its teeth. "Stick to your mop, table wiper." He left the room. The machines kept beeping. Emma slept on. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened the next morning, when everything Danielle had been holding together, all the training, all the discipline, all the years of knowing when to speak and when to stay silent, became completely inadequate for what was about to walk through those doors. The alarm started at 4:41 a.m. 3 short bursts, then a sustained wail that cut through the pediatric unit like shrapnel through flesh. Danielle heard it from the supply closet where she was restocking trauma shears, the same model she'd used in Baghdad, same weight in her hands, same satisfying click when the blade snapped open. But she wasn't in Baghdad. She was in Houston, pushing a mop, watching a child die in increments. She moved toward the sound. Emma's room was chaos wearing hospital whites. The ventilator was screaming. The child's small body arched off the mattress in a convulsion so violent her heels drummed against the bed rail, a rhythm like distant gunfire. Dr. Sterling stood at the monitor with his phone already at his ear, barking orders to the code team, push another 500 milligrams of levetiracetam 4. "We're looking at breakthrough seizure activity." His voice carried the absolute certainty of a man who had never been wrong and never would be. Get me the pharmacy. I want phenobarbital standing by. Danielle stepped into the doorway. She wasn't supposed to be there. She'd been reassigned yesterday, effective immediately, Sterling had said, with the flat smile of a predator who had already calculated the kill, but protocols mean nothing when a child is dying. Lieutenant Garrett stood with his hands pressed against the glass partition, watching his daughter convulse. His jaw was clenched tight enough to fracture bone. The muscles in his forearms trembled, not from weakness, but from the kind of restraint it takes when you want to break something and you know you shouldn't. Danielle recognized that tremor. She'd seen it in the mirror for 18 years. What they didn't know was that every seizure was getting worse because they were treating the wrong disease. Emma's pupils were unequal. Danielle could see it from the doorway. The left one dilated almost to black, the right one responding sluggishly to the overhead lights. That wasn't epilepsy. That was a child's brain swelling against her skull. Her breathing had shifted too, shallow, almost gasping, with a slight whistling on each inhale. And her neck. Danielle watched the muscles cord and release as another seizure built in Emma's small frame, and she noticed the stiffness. The way the child couldn't flex her chin toward her chest. Fever. Stiff neck. Unequal pupils. Seizures that got worse instead of better each time they loaded more barbiturates into her blood. Not epilepsy. Never epilepsy. Encephalitis. The thought arrived with the weight of a certainty that came from 18 years of field medicine, from Fallujah and Sanjan Valley, from holding 4 bags in rooms where the walls blared and the only light came from muzzle flashes. Pain is information. That's what the instructors had said at the Naval Special Warfare Center. Your body is screaming at you in a language older than language. Listen to it. Danielle's body was screaming now, not in pain, but in recognition. She didn't flinch. Didn't move. Just watched the monitor climb, 142 beats per minute, climbing toward 150. The oxygen saturation ticking downward like a doomsday clock. 94, 92. 91. Sterling stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, reviewing the chart with the expression of a man examining a difficult but ultimately manageable problem. Increase the levetiracetam dosing to 750 milligrams, he said without looking up. And someone get those labs pulled from yesterday. I want to see if we're missing a drug interaction. The room moved around him like planets orbiting the sun. Danielle moved into the room instead of staying in the doorway. Nobody stopped her. In crisis, the hierarchy collapses. Custodians and cardiologists become the same thing, hands. She walked to the bed and leaned down so her mouth was inches from Emma's ear, and even though the child was seizing, even though her brain was misfiring and her body was betraying her, Danielle spoke in the voice she'd used in Baghdad. The voice that had kept people alive when everything else had failed. I need your father, she said to Lieutenant Garrett, not looking away from Emma. Right now. Private. He was at the doorway before she finished the sentence. They moved into the hallway. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects trapped in a jar. Danielle could hear the ventilator through the glass, could hear Sterling's voice still issuing orders, could hear Emma's body slamming against the mattress with each successive seizure. The pain in that sound was a language older than words. Recent deployments, Danielle said. Not a question. A command. Where? How long? Any tick exposure? Garrett's eyes narrowed. Why? Because your daughter isn't having seizures. She's having encephalitis. Danielle kept her voice flat. Factual. The way you state a coordinate or an objective. Probably tick-borne. The fever, the stiff neck, the unequal pupils, Sterling's treating this like epilepsy when it's a tick-borne pathogen causing inflammation in her brain tissue. Every seizure medication he pushes is just making the swelling worse. How do you? Where were you deployed? Baghdad. Sadr City. Returned stateside 4 weeks ago. Garrett's voice shifted. He was a SEAL too, she realized. Not in the same way Danielle had been, but the training was visible in how he thought: rapid assessment, acknowledge the threat, plan the counter. Our compound had a significant tick population. They said it was typical for the region, nothing serious. For weeks, Emma would have been bitten during visitation. The incubation period for tick-borne encephalitis was 10 to 14 days. The timeline collapsed into perfect, terrible clarity. Danielle turned back toward the room. "We need to." The door opened. Sterling stepped out, his expression unchanged, his phone already in his hand. He looked at Danielle the way a man looks at a wasp that has landed on his sleeve. "Not threatening yet. Just annoying." "You're on the wrong floor," he said. His voice was pleasant. That made it worse. "Emma needs a lumbar puncture," Danielle said. "Cerebrospinal fluid analysis. Encephalitis workup. And we need to search for." "I'm aware of what lumbar punctures are." Sterling smiled. The smile of a man who had been right every single time his credentials had been questioned. "I'm also aware that our patient is seizing because of uncontrolled epilepsy, not because of some exotic disease you've decided to chase. We're not wasting time with wild theories from—" He paused. The smile didn't falter, but something underneath shifted, some recognition that he was about to say something he might regret. From someone without the training to be in this room. Danielle didn't respond. She stood perfectly still, her hands at her sides, her breathing controlled. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. "Get back to maintenance," Sterling said, and he went back into the room. The next voice Danielle heard was the code team lead calling out vitals. O2 sat is down to 88. "We're losing her." Danielle didn't remember moving. Muscle memory took over, the same muscle memory that had carried her through 18 years of field medicine, through moments where thinking meant dying. She was in the room. She was beside Emma's head. She was looking at the child's neck, at the small dark line of hair curling just above the collar of the hospital gown, and she was reaching for the hair to brush it back because Emma's seizures were slowing now, becoming more frequent, less violent, which meant the swelling was pressing harder against her brain stem. And that's when she saw it. The tick. Embedded in the soft skin behind Emma's right ear, no bigger than a sesame seed, its body distended with blood. A deer tick, probably, the kind that carried Powassan virus through the wetlands of southeastern Texas. The kind that had been breeding in the Baghdad compound where Lieutenant Garrett had spent the last 4 weeks teaching Iraqi soldiers how to survive in a city that wanted them dead. The kind that nobody had thought to look for. "I need a forceps," Danielle said. Her voice sounded different. Lower. "No, please." "No apology. Just information." "Get her out of here," Sterling said. Danielle reached for the forceps on the supply tray. She held it steady. She gripped the tick as close to the mouthparts as possible. She pulled straight up, slow and controlled, the way you extract ordnance, no sudden movements, no jerking, nothing that leaves pieces behind. The tick came free. Whole. Danielle dropped it into a specimen cup and handed it to the nearest nurse without looking away from Emma's ear. "Genus Seizures," she said. "Send it for Powassan testing. And get me 200 milligrams of doxycycline 4, diluted for pediatric dosing. We're starting antiviral and antimicrobial therapy in the next 60 seconds. Sterling's face went white. Not from anger. From understanding. In that moment, he knew. Not just that Danielle was right, though she was. But that she knew exactly what was happening in his consultation network. 12 different doctors, none of them actually present, all of them billing maximum consultation fees for diagnoses they'd never personally verified. And a custodian was about to expose it all. What happened next changed everything. Sterling's phone was already in his hand. His eyes locked with Danielle's for exactly 2 seconds, and in that moment, she watched him calculate. He was good at calculations. He'd calculated how to build an empire on the backs of people who trusted him. He'd calculated how to insulate himself with allies and protocols and the assumption that nobody would ever question a board-certified neurologist. He hadn't calculated this. Sterling walked out of the room. Danielle heard him in the hallway, his voice suddenly urgent, suddenly different. Yes, board chair. We have a code situation here that's complicated by a rogue employee who's outside her scope. I need to activate the emergency ethics review. Yes, now. I'm looking at potential harm to patient care. Emma's oxygen saturation was climbing. 92, 94. 95. The doxycycline was already flowing through her full line, the medication hitting her bloodstream like reinforcement reaching a besieged position. Her breathing eased. The seizure activity was slowing. Danielle stood at the child's bedside with her hands folded in front of her and watched the monitor pulse back towards stable. She could hear Sterling's voice carrying through the hallway walls. We'll need security to escort her from the building pending investigation. No, I don't believe she should have access to any patient care areas going forward. The room was quiet except for the ventilator and the monitor and the sound of Emma's breathing evening out into something almost normal. Lieutenant Garrett was staring at Danielle with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not gratitude, that would come later, if it came at all. Just recognition. The look of one soldier seeing another soldier operate in the field, where protocols are suggestions and the only rule that matters is keeping people alive. Thank you, he said. Danielle didn't respond. She was already thinking 3 moves ahead. Sterling had just activated an ethics investigation. He'd already called her references. He was already rewriting the narrative, positioning himself as the guardian of patient safety and Danielle as the unstable employee who'd been warned twice and violated protocol anyway. She walked toward the door. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she was right, and nobody who mattered would believe her in time. Dr. Sterling's face went purple the moment the lab results came back positive. Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Not epilepsy. Not a seizure disorder that required 16 more milligrams of medication that was poisoning the child's system. A tick. A single deer tick that Danielle had found while 12 physicians, 12, had missed it entirely. He stood at the nurse's station, hands shaking as he reached for his phone. His voice came out steady, controlled, the voice of a man who had spent 30 years learning how to weaponize institutional power. He dialed the hospital board chairman, his golfing partner. The 2 men had played 18 holes together every Thursday for the past 7 years. We have a credentialing emergency. A nursing staff member has violated scope of practice, made unauthorized diagnoses, and undermined physician authority in a way that could expose us to liability. His words were precise. Calculated. He wasn't raising his voice. He didn't need to. The machinery was already moving. Within the hour, Danielle was summoned to the Human Resources office on the 3rd floor. The room smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and the particular staleness of air that had recycled through the same vent since 2008. 2 administrators she'd never seen before sat across from a mahogany table that cost more than her monthly rent. They didn't make eye contact. One of them slid a document across the surface. Effective immediately, pending the completion of a formal ethics investigation, your nursing license is suspended. You are not to enter patient care areas. You are not to access hospital systems. You are not to communicate with any staff members regarding patient care. The woman's voice carried the flat effect of someone reading from a script she'd read 100 times before. This is not a termination. This is a suspension. Do you understand? Danielle understood perfectly. Dr. Sterling had moved fast. She'd expected strategic maneuvering, repositioning, the slow institutional strangulation that took weeks. Instead, he'd activated the nuclear option within 90 minutes of Emma's fever breaking. The tick was in the lab. The testing was conclusive. And somehow, that made her guilty instead of vindicated. She nodded once. No point in arguing. Arguments were for people who still believed the system worked. The badge came off her neck with a soft click. She set it on the mahogany table, the laminate photo showing her face from 3 years ago, when she still looked like she believed things like justice and merit existed in hospitals. The badge settled there, plastic and official and suddenly worthless. A symbolic gesture, the kind of thing that used to make her angry. Now it just made her tired. The hallway back to the locker room was empty except for the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like insects trapped in plastic. She could feel eyes watching from behind closed office doors. Nobody spoke. Nobody stopped her. The custodian who'd saved a child's life was now a pariah, and the infection was so complete that even proximity might be contagious. Her scrubs were still damp from the morning shift. She folded them carefully into her locker, the muscle memory of 1,000 shifts making her hands move even though her mind had checked out somewhere around the moment Sterling's golfing partner had answered the phone. She left the hospital at 2:27 p.m. The parking lot was hot and empty, the kind of Houston heat that made the asphalt shimmer like water. Her car smelled like coffee and old receipts. She drove home with her hand steady on the wheel, her breathing controlled, her face blank. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part happened at 6:15 p.m., when her son found her. She was sitting at the kitchen table in her scrubs, the one she'd put back on without thinking, the uniform so ingrained in her nervous system that changing out of it felt like shedding skin. The house was quiet. The air conditioning hummed. Outside, the sun was bleeding orange across the suburban rooftops of Houston, turning the sky the color of old blood. She'd been staring at nothing for 2 hours. The coffee in front of her was cold enough that a thin film had formed on the surface. The back door opened. Tommy was 10 years old, small for his age, with her dark hair and his father's serious eyes. He'd been at soccer camp. He wasn't supposed to be home until 7. His coach must have ended early. He looked at her, still in scrubs, still sitting in the darkness with no lights on, and something shifted in his face. Mom. His voice did that thing it did when he was confused. Higher. Smaller. Why are you home? She tried to speak. The words didn't come. It wasn't that she didn't know what to say. It was that she didn't know how to explain that the thing you did that was right, the thing you did that saved a child's life, could destroy everything you'd built. How do you explain that to a 10-year-old who thinks the world runs on logic? He set his soccer bag down slowly. Did you do something wrong? That was the question that broke her. Not an accusation. Just a question. Just a child trying to understand why his mother was sitting in the dark wearing scrubs that she wore when she was supposed to be at work, trying to make sense of a world where people who did the right thing got punished for it. She pulled him close without answering. Her arms came around him and held, and she could feel him tense because she never did this, never just held him like she was drowning and he was the only thing floating. In 17 years of raising this boy alone, through 2 deployments of PTSD and 3 rounds of therapy and a life built on compartmentalization and discipline, she had never let him see her break. She was breaking now. The tears came quietly, the kind that don't make noise, just moisture running down her face while she held her son tight enough that he made a small sound of protest. She didn't answer his question. She couldn't. How could she tell him that she'd done everything right? That she'd seen something that was wrong and she'd fixed it, and the system had crushed her for it? That the truth didn't matter? That being right just meant you were alone? Tommy's arms came up around her neck. 10 years old and already learning that love sometimes looked like being held by someone who was falling apart. It's okay, Mom. It's okay. He was patting her back like she'd patted his back 1,000 times when he was scared. She wanted to tell him it would be okay. She wanted to believe it. Instead, she just held her son in the darkness of the kitchen while the coffee got colder and the world outside turned from orange to purple to black, and somewhere in a hospital across Houston, Emma Garrett was alive because of what she'd done, and it had cost her everything anyway. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. No footsteps. No traffic. No machines beeping. Just a mother and a son, and the terrible knowledge that doing the right thing sometimes meant standing alone while the people around you chose comfort over conscience. She didn't know yet that the comfort was about to be shattered. She didn't know that in 3 days, a man would arrive at Sacred Heart with a shrapnel wound and a memory that went back 16 years. She didn't know that her face would trigger recognition, and that recognition would unravel everything Sterling had built, and that the military would come back for her in ways she'd spent 2 decades trying to forget. For now, she just held her son and let herself break, because some battles leave you standing but shattered, and the only victory that mattered was that a child would wake up tomorrow breathing easy, and no amount of institutional cruelty could change that. Even if it had cost her everything. 3 days later, the ER doors slid open and a man walked through them bleeding, shrapnel lodged in his shoulder, his left arm hanging useless at his side, his face the color of old concrete. Danielle was called back from suspension to handle overflow, her badge reinstated by a nervous administrator who wouldn't meet her eyes. She was pulling on gloves when the man's gaze found her across the triage station. His whole body went still. The waiting room noise seemed to drain away, replaced only by the steady beep of a monitor somewhere behind the curtains. "You," he whispered. His voice cracked like old leather. "You? Sadra City. 2004, you carried the children out." The gloves froze halfway over her hands. She looked at him, really looked, and something ancient stirred in her chest, a memory that lived deeper than bone. The neighborhood. The collapsed building. The dust so thick you couldn't see your own boots. Small hands gripping her armor. "I don't," she started. "You pulled my nephew from the rubble. His name was Hassan. You held him like he mattered. Like he was human." The man's eyes were wet now, tracking her face with the intensity of someone reading scripture. His mother thought he was dead. "You brought him back." Lieutenant Garrett, still stationed at Emma's bedside 3 floors up, had overheard the exchange from the hallway. He walked into the triage area with the measured stride of someone trained to move through hostile territory, and he looked directly at the translator. "What rank?" His voice was a command, not a question. The man's hands trembled as he read her name tag, her position listed as custodian. But his eyes had already moved to her jacket, the one hanging on the chair behind the triage desk. He stared at it the way a man stares at something he thought was lost to fire. "She saved my nephew that day. Pulled him from rubble. Your patch." He was pointing now, his voice breaking. "That patch. I remember that patch." Danielle's hand moved without conscious thought, reaching for her jacket. Her fingers found the small tear in the inner lining where the faded unit patch still clung, sewn there 18 years ago by someone who needed to remember who she'd been before she became invisible. The Navy SEAL insignia was barely visible now, worn soft by time and washing, but the number was there, ST3. Charlie Platoon. The patch was the size of a playing card and worth more than all the credentials in the hospital. The SEAL team leader arrived at Sacred Heart for the scheduled charity event, a commander with 3 stars on his collar and eyes that had seen the same dust, the same rubble, the same impossible choices. He was walking through the administrative corridor when he caught sight of that patch in a nurse's hand, the same hand holding it up to the light like it might disappear. He stopped moving. The other officers behind him nearly collided with his stillness. "That patch number," he said quietly. His voice carried the weight of command, the kind that makes a room reorganize itself around sound alone. "I know that patch number." He walked to the triage station where Danielle stood, and the crowd of hospital staff seemed to gather without anyone deciding to gather, a gravitational pull toward something true. The commander's voice was clear and steady, the kind that had briefed presidents and directed combat operations from 30,000 feet. Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross earned 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart in Baghdad. She held a field hospital under fire for 16 hours. She's the operator who carried out 7 children when the structure began collapsing. She did that after taking shrapnel in both legs. The room went dead silent. Not the silence of fear or shock, but the silence of recalibration, of everything shifting on its axis. Emma's father stood in that silence with tears tracking down his face. A combat pilot who had sat helpless at his daughter's bedside while 12 different doctors rotated through without touching her chart with any genuine care. A man who had finally met someone who actually looked. The FBI agents arrived within the hour. Two men in dark suits, moving with the precise efficiency of federal investigators who had already built their case before walking through the door. They went straight to Dr. Sterling's office. The words were clinical and formal. "We need to discuss your specialist network and insurance billing practices." His face went the color of old ash. The board members he'd called for favors suddenly didn't return messages. The ethics investigator who'd written up Danielle recused himself when his connection to Sterling surfaced in the financial records, kickbacks disguised as conference attendance, consultant fees for services never rendered. The news cameras that had been set up for the charity event swiveled toward the real story like predators catching scent. Sterling's office was sealed within 2 hours. His computer seized. His files opened. 217 patient charts were pulled for review, and the pattern emerged like something that had always been visible if anyone bothered to look. Consultations billed but never performed. Specialist signatures on protocols the specialists hadn't written. Insurance claims totaling $847,000 from a consultation network that existed only on billing statements. His medical license was suspended by noon. The hospital released a statement that was careful and corporate but unmistakable: Sacred Heart does not tolerate fraud or abuse of patient trust. By evening, Sterling was escorted from the building by the same security guards who had removed Danielle 3 days prior. His attorney released a countering statement blaming overzealous prosecutors and a disgruntled employee, but the evidence was already in federal hands, already being uploaded to servers where it would sit until trial. 12 doctors in his network received notification letters the following morning. The scale of the fraud had expanded beyond what Sterling had managed alone. The conspiracy had roots that went back for years, touching insurance fraud, kickback schemes, and systematic billing for work that was never done. Every single one of them had rubber-stamped Sterling's protocols on papers marked expert review without so much as opening a patient file. Lieutenant Garrett gave an interview to the local news that evening. He sat in his dress uniform with Emma asleep against his shoulder, fully recovered now, breathing easy because someone had actually looked at her. "A janitor saved my daughter's life," he said, his voice steady as ordnance. "Because she actually looked at her. 12 doctors billed my insurance company without touching her. One nurse, one person everyone looked past, saved her." He turned the camera toward Danielle, who stood just inside the frame, her composure intact, her expression unreadable as granite. "That's who we should be thanking. That's who we should be listening to." The hospital offered Danielle full reinstatement with back pay. They offered promotions, oversight of quality control, her name on plaques. She declined it all. She was done hiding. She was done being invisible. She was done pretending that the woman with the faded patch inside her jacket was someone the hospital had the right to erase. But she didn't leave. Not entirely. Something about Sacred Heart had changed the moment her rank walked into that room. The institution didn't own her, but the people in it, the ones who had watched the truth unfold, they were worth staying for. The rain outside the hospital hammered down like applause, the kind of downpour that only comes after everything has been made clean and broken at once. Don't pick a fight with someone who has nothing left to lose. Danielle Ross had already lost everything that mattered to people who counted rank in dollars and authority in silence. What she had left couldn't be taken, couldn't be humiliated, couldn't be written up or investigated or disappeared. It could only be finally seen. If you've ever been retaliated against for speaking the truth in a hospital, workplace, or institution, you have options: federal protection laws, documentation rights, whistleblower channels. Danielle's meticulous records became the roadmap for investigation. Yours could become evidence. Share your own stories in the comments. Subscribe for more cases where the quiet person in the room turns out to be the one holding it all together.